creator of one of the web's most talked about libraries made a public promise. He said plainly, there will never be an HTMX 3. Not probably not. Not no current plans. A promise. Version 2 was the destination. No more breaking changes, no more upgrade treadmills, no more rewriting your application because a framework author had a new idea. In a field where the average JavaScript tool asks you to relearn everything every 18 months, that promise was the entire point of the project. And then came HTMX 4. Now, before you write the cynical comment, read that again, because the joke is genuinely good. He never said anything about a version 4. That's not just a punchline. It's a window into a piece of software engineering philosophy that's worth 25 minutes of your time, whether or not you ever write a line of HTMX. Because underneath the gag is a real question that every developer eventually has to answer. What do you owe the people who built on your work? So here's the video. What HTMX actually is, in plain English, assuming you've never touched it. The real story behind skipping version 3. The 3 big changes in 4.0. One of which the creator describes as fixing his own biggest mistake. What genuinely breaks and what your migration actually looks like. The promise he made to people who don't want to migrate at all. The adoption story almost nobody is covering. A major platform rebuilding its core on this. The honest section on when HTMX is absolutely the wrong choice. And the argument I haven't seen anyone else make. Why this particular design might be the most AI agent-friendly architecture on the web right now. Confirmed versus reported, as always. Let's get into it. Actually, hold on. Before anything else, one correction, because you may have already seen headlines announcing that HTMX 4 is out, and I went and checked rather than repeating them. As I record this, HTMX's own homepage says the following, word for word. HTMX v4 is under active development and is now in beta, with a target release date of summer 2026. And if you look at the quick start code on that same page, the snippet they hand to every new user, it still installs the 2.0 line. So let's be precise, because precision is the whole point of this channel. HTMX 4 is real. It's public. It's in beta. It's been through a long series of betas and release candidates, and its target window is right now, summer of 2026. What it is not, as of this recording, is the version they're telling newcomers to install. Why does that distinction matter? 2 practical reasons. If you're starting a project this week and you install HTMX 4 expecting a finished release, you're adopting a beta, which is a completely legitimate choice, but it should be a choice made with open eyes, not a surprise. And if you're maintaining an HTMX 2 application and you're feeling migration anxiety because a headline told you the new version is here, relax. It isn't the default, you're not behind, and as you'll see later in this video, the maintainers have gone unusually far out of their way to make sure you never have to feel that anxiety at all. Release stages move fast, so check htmx.org and the dedicated 4.htmx.org site for the current status. Both are linked below. Everything else in this video is about what HTMX 4 is and what it will mean, which doesn't change whether the stable tag lands this week or next month. Right, now let's back up. First, what is HTMX? For anyone who's only ever heard the name shouted in an argument. Start with the problem it solves. For about a decade, the default way to build an interactive website has been run a JavaScript framework in the browser, keep a copy of your application state on the client, have the server send raw data as JSON, and let the client turn that data into HTML. That's the React model, the Vue model, the Angular model, and it's genuinely powerful. It's also why a simple web app now involves a build step, a bundler, a package manager, a state management library, a hydration strategy, and a few hundred megabytes of dependencies. HTMX asks a different question. What if the server just sent HTML? Here's the whole idea. In normal HTML, only 2 elements can make a request to the server, links and forms. And when they do, the response replaces the entire page. That's it. Those are the rules of the web, and they've barely changed since the 90s. HTMX removes those restrictions with a handful of HTML attributes. Any element can make a request, not just links and forms. Any kind of request, not just get and post. It can be triggered by any event. A click, a keystroke, an element scrolling into view. Not just clicking and submitting. And critically, the response can replace any part of the page rather than all of it. So instead of writing JavaScript that fetches JSON, parses it, builds DOM nodes, and inserts them, you write an HTML attribute that says, when this button is clicked, ask the server for this URL and put whatever HTML comes back into that div. The server sends finished HTML. The browser swaps it in. There is no client-side state, no build step, and no JSON layer in the middle. Your server-side language does all the logic, and HTML is the wire format. That approach has a name, Hypermedia. It's not new, it's arguably the original architecture of the web, which HTMX's community will happily tell you at length. What's new is applying it with modern ergonomics. 2 facts to anchor the scale. First, the library is small. The project lists it at roughly 16 kilobytes minified and compressed, dependency-free, added with a single script tag and no build step. But the number I find more persuasive is a different one they publish. In a documented real-world port of a React application to HTMX, the codebase shrank by 67%. That's not the library's file size. That's 2/3 of the application code ceasing to exist, which tells you the real story. The saving was never mainly the download. It was everything you stop having to write. Second, the license is BSD zero clause, which is about as permissive as software licensing gets. Effectively, do whatever you want, no conditions. It launched in November 2020. It's been in the GitHub Accelerator program. It's the successor to an even older project of Carson's called intercooler.js, and its 2.0 line has been quietly stable for years. That's the thing we're talking about. Now let's talk about why it just changed. The promise, and why it got kept in the most technically correct way possible. The creator is Carson Gross, and the no version 3 promise wasn't marketing. It came from a genuine philosophical position. HTMX is meant to be finished software, not abandoned, finished. The idea that a library can reach a state where it does what it set out to do and then simply keeps doing that indefinitely without dragging its users through migrations for the maintainer's convenience. If you've ever inherited a code base that couldn't be upgraded because 3 major versions had passed and the migration path had rotted, you understand why that promise made people emotional about a JavaScript library. So what changed his mind? 2 things, and they're both worth understanding. The first is that he built something else. A tiny library called Fixie, a stripped-to-the-bone, minimal take on the same Hypermedia idea, small enough to read in one sitting. And building it did what building a cleanroom version of your own work always does. It showed him in sharp relief which parts of HTMX were essential and which were accumulated barnacles. 5 years of supporting a widely used library will do that anyway. Building a tiny competitor to yourself accelerates it. The second is a technical forcing function, and it's the actual headline of this release. He wanted to replace the ancient plumbing at HTMX's core, and that change is breaking unavoidably, no matter how carefully you do it, which left a genuinely awkward choice. Break the promise and ship HTMX 3, or don't ship the improvement at all. He picked door 3, or rather, door 4, keep the letter of the promise, skip the number entirely, ship HTMX 4, and the essay announcing it is titled, "I Love This." You can read that as a lawyer's trick if you're feeling uncharitable. I read it differently. He made a promise about not putting his users through an unnecessary migration, and then found a change so worthwhile that the honest move was to be transparent about the tension rather than pretend it didn't exist. And as we'll see in a bit, the way he's handling the rollout backs that reading up substantially. 5. Change number 1, here's the guts of it. Since the beginning, HTMX has made its network requests using XML HTTP request, an API that's been in browsers since the early 2000s. It's the plumbing that made the original AJAX revolution possible, and it works. It's also a museum piece, a callback-based, quirky, pre-promise API that exists in its current shape largely because of Internet Explorer compatibility that stopped mattering years ago. The modern replacement is Fetch, a promise-based, async-friendly, standards-current API that every browser has supported for years and that essentially all new JavaScript uses. HTMX 4 swaps, XML HTTP request for fetch at its core. Now on the surface, that sounds like the least exciting kind of change, internal plumbing that users shouldn't notice. And for the majority of HTMX usage, that's true. If your app is mostly attributes on elements, you'll barely feel it. But here's why it's a major version bump anyway. The event model has to change. HTMX exposes a rich set of events, things firing before a request, after a response, on errors, on swaps, and a lot of real applications hook into them for loading indicators, error handling, analytics, and custom behavior. Those events were shaped around XML HTTP requests lifecycle. Fetch has a fundamentally different one. So the events shift, and anything you wrote against them needs revisiting. That's the honest core of the breaking change. Not that your attributes stop working, but that your JavaScript glue around HTMX needs review. And since a breaking change was unavoidable anyway, the team did the sensible thing. Used the opportunity to fix the other accumulated design regrets in one go, rather than dribbling them out over years. Which is exactly what a responsible maintainer should do, and it's why one prominent commentator described HTMX as a very responsibly run project, even while noting the version number cheekiness. What Fetch actually unlocks, and this is the part that made me sit up. Replacing old plumbing with new plumbing is fine. But fetch brings a capability XML HTTP request fundamentally couldn't offer cleanly: streaming. Here's the difference in plain English. XML HTTP request buffers. The server sends a response, the browser holds the entire thing until it's complete, and only then does your application get to see it. Everything arrives at once, or not at all. Fetch, through something called readable streams, lets you process a response as it arrives. First chunk in, first chunk rendered. The server can start sending, and the page can start updating before the response is finished. Think about what that enables in a Hypermedia app. Progressive rendering of a slow page, the header and first results appear while the rest is still being computed. Long-running operations that report progress as they go, natively, without you hand-rolling server-sent events or WebSockets for what should be a simple case. A list that populates as the database yields rows, rather than after. And now let me make the connection that I don't think anyone else covering this release has made, because it's the reason this matters to viewers of this channel specifically. Language models stream. That's their native behavior. Tokens arrive one at a time, and every AI interface you've ever used is built around rendering that stream as it comes. Until now, if you wanted to build an AI feature into a Hypermedia app, streaming was precisely the case where the simple approach broke down, and you reached for a JavaScript framework or a bespoke SSE setup. HTMX 4's core now speaks the same shape as an LLM response. A server endpoint that streams model output and a page that renders it as it arrives, with attributes instead of a framework. That's not a small convenience. That's the last major reason a certain class of developer felt forced into a heavy client-side stack, quietly removed. We'll come back to this. Change number 2, explicit inheritance, and the creator calling out his own biggest mistake. This one is the most interesting design decision in the release, and it's the kind of thing that only comes from years of watching people use your work. In HTMX today, many attributes inherit down the DOM tree implicitly. Put a configuration attribute on a parent element, and every child inside it silently picks up that behavior, unless something overrides it. It's convenient. Set a default once at the top, and everything below just works. Carson Gross's own assessment. In his words, making attribute inheritance implicit was the biggest mistake in HTMX 1.0 and 2.0. Why? Because implicit behavior is invisible behavior. Picture debugging a real application. An element is doing something you didn't ask it to do, and the cause is an attribute on a div 4 levels up the tree that someone added 8 months ago for an unrelated reason. Nothing in the element you're looking at explains its own behavior. You have to reconstruct the whole ancestry in your head, or worse, in a debugger, at 11 at night. It's the same class of problem that made global variables, deep prototype chains, and cascading style specificity into famous sources of pain. Convenient to write, miserable to reason about later. The cost isn't paid at the keyboard, it's paid in every future reading of that code by everyone. So HTMX 4 makes inheritance explicit. If you want a behavior to apply to descendants, you say so deliberately. Slightly more typing, vastly more legibility. When you look at an element, what it does is either written on it or explicitly declared to reach it. No spooky action at a distance. And I want to sit on the meta point for a second because it's the real reason I find this release admirable. A maintainer publicly identifying his own most used feature as his biggest design error and then breaking compatibility to fix it, that's rare. The much easier path is to leave the wart, call it flexibility, and let users deal with it forever. Choosing the harder, more honest path is exactly what you want from someone maintaining infrastructure you depend on. Change number 3, history, done the boring way. Here's one that will make anyone who's fought with it grin. In HTMX2, browser history was clever. When you navigated, HTMX would take a snapshot of your entire DOM, stash it in the browser's session storage, and when you hit the back button, restore that snapshot instantly. Very fast, very smart, and very fragile. Because DOM snapshots capture a moment in time, and moments in time are full of things that don't survive being frozen and thawed. Third-party scripts that mutated the page, components with internal state, media elements mid-playback, anything injected after load. It mostly worked, and when it didn't, the failure was bizarre and hard to reproduce, which is the worst kind of bug. HTMX 4's approach. When you hit back, just ask the server for the page again. That's it. No snapshot, no session storage, no restoration logic. Exactly what a browser did in 1998. Slightly slower in the best case, correct in every case. And if you genuinely love the caching behavior, it'll be available as an extension rather than baked into the core. I think this one is quietly the most instructive change in the release. Because it's a removal. A clever feature deleted in favor of a boring one that always works. That's a maturity signal. And it's the same instinct behind the whole project. Fewer moving parts, more predictability, less magic to debug at 11 at night. So what actually breaks? The honest migration section. Let's be straight, because this is where a hype video would wave its hands and move on. Moving from HTMX2 to HTMX4 is a real upgrade project. The creator says so himself in the announcement and apologizes for it directly, noting that going 1.0 to 2.0 didn't ask this of people, and 2.0 to 4.0 does. Here's the shape of the work. Your event handlers need review. That's the fetch change, and it's the big one. Anything you wrote hooking into HTMX's request lifecycle needs checking against the new model. Your inherited attributes need to become explicit. Anywhere you relied on a parent's configuration silently applying to children, you now declare it. That's mechanical, but you have to find all of them. Your history behavior changes. If you depended on instant snapshot restoration, you're now making a network request instead, and you should check that your back button experience still feels right. And any extension or third-party integration needs to be checked for 4.0 compatibility because the internals it was written against have changed. One helpful note from the field: during the beta process, the team restored support for the data-hx- prefixed syntax alongside the plain hx- attributes, which matters for anyone whose tooling or validators prefer standards-compliant data attributes. That kind of responsiveness during a beta is a good sign about how this migration is being handled. None of that is catastrophic. All of it is real work. If you have a large HTMX2 application, budget a project, not an afternoon. Which brings me to the promise inside the promise. And this is the part that redeems the version number joke entirely. 3 commitments with this release, and they matter more than any technical detail. 1. HTMX 2.0 will be supported in perpetuity, not for 18 months, not until the next LTS. In perpetuity, the same commitment already made to HTMX 1.0 and to intercooler.js, the project that preceded it. The stated position is explicit. If HTMX 2.0 satisfies your needs, there is absolutely no pressure to upgrade. Ever. Sit with how unusual that is. The entire economics of modern web tooling runs on upgrade pressure. Security patches gated behind major versions, ecosystems that abandon old branches, documentation that quietly deletes the old way. A maintainer saying, the version you're on will keep working and we'll keep supporting it forever, and you may simply ignore this release, is close to unheard of. 2. The rollout is deliberately slow, over a multi-year period. As with the 1.0 to 2.0 transition, there'll be a long stretch where 2.x remains the latest tag and 4.x sits as next. The published timeline had an alpha well before the release, general availability during 2026, and 4.0 not becoming the default recommendation until roughly 2027. Nobody gets forced anywhere by a package manager default. 3. Transparency during development. The work happened in a public branch with a public preview site, so anyone could watch the dust fly. Put those together, and the version number gag stops looking like a technicality and starts looking like the opposite of what usually happens. The promise was never really about the digit. It was about not making people migrate against their will. And measured against that promise, perpetual support, multi-year rollout, no forced default, it's being kept. And notice how that commitment has already been honored once. The HTMX 1.x line, the one that still supported Internet Explorer, which 2.x dropped, is, per their own site today, still supported in perpetuity, with its own documentation site standing. That's not a promise about the future. That's a promise they've already kept through a previous major version, which is the only kind of evidence that actually counts. One practical note, repeating it because it matters. As of this recording, 4.0 is in beta with a summer 2026 target, and the 2.0 line is what the project still hands to new users. Check htmx-.org and 4-.htmx-.org for current status before you plan anything, both linked below. Now the adoption story that almost nobody is covering. It's easy to dismiss HTMX as a thing that's popular in blog posts and unpopular in production. So here's a concrete counterexample, and it's a big one. Drupal, the content management system that runs an enormous number of government, university, and enterprise sites, is rebuilding its core AJAX system on HTMX. This isn't a rumor or a proposal, it's tracked publicly in Drupal's own issue queue, tagged as an official initiative, flagged as a blocker tied to their next major release. The work has been proceeding against HTMX 4 betas directly, with the Drupal team receiving pre-release builds from the HTMX team, testing against them and reporting back, including the feedback that led to that data-hx- syntax restoration I mentioned. Think about what that means. A 20-year-old CMS with an immense installed base, a conservative and security-focused engineering culture, and users who cannot tolerate churn That project looked at the landscape of front-end options and chose the 14 kilobyte Hypermedia library, and chose to build against a pre-release of its next major version, in the open, with the maintainers. That's the strongest signal in this entire story, and it's the part his coverage of this news mostly skips. Benchmarks are arguable. A major platform betting its core interaction layer on your library, in public, with a release blocker tag on it, that's not arguable. The size argument, and the honest caveat on it. You'll hear the numbers constantly in this space, roughly 14 kilobytes for HTMX versus about 47 for React, 3.5 times less JavaScript. No build step, no bundler, one script tag. That comparison is real, and for the right kind of application it compounds beautifully. Less to download, less to parse, less to go wrong, and no build pipeline to maintain, break, or explain to a new hire. But let me give you the honest caveat, because the comparison is also a little unfair in both directions. Unfair to React. React's size buys you a component model, an ecosystem of tens of thousands of pre-built pieces, and machinery designed for applications with genuinely complex client-side state. If you're building something that looks like a spreadsheet, a design tool, or a live collaborative editor, that machinery isn't bloat. It's the actual product requirement. Unfair to HTMX. The kilobyte comparison undersells it. The real saving usually isn't the library size. It's everything you don't build around it. No JSON API layer that exists purely to feed your own front end. No duplicate validation logic on both sides. No state synchronization bugs. No hydration mismatches. For a lot of applications, the second system, the one you build in the browser to mirror the one on the server, simply stops existing. That's worth vastly more than 33 kilobytes. So use the size number as a symptom, not the argument. The argument is architectural. When HTMX is the wrong choice, and this section is mandatory, I don't want anyone watching this to go rewrite a working application on the strength of an enthusiastic video. So here's the honest map of where this approach struggles. When your app has genuinely rich client state, design tools, spreadsheets, video editors, drawing applications, live multiplayer canvases, anything where a large amount of interactive state lives in the browser and changes constantly without server involvement. Hypermedia's core assumption is that the server owns the state. If that assumption is false for your product, you're fighting the tool. When you need offline, if your application must work with no network, a field data app, an offline-first mobile experience, you cannot ask the server for HTML. That's disqualifying, not a preference. When latency dominates, every interaction being a server round trip is fine at 50 milliseconds and painful at 400. If your users are geographically distant from your servers and every keystroke needs a response, the client-side model has a real advantage. When your team's expertise is the deciding factor. A team of 5 experienced React developers shipping a product next quarter should probably ship it in React. The best architecture on paper loses to the one your team can debug at 2 a.m. That's not a cop-out. It's the actual calculus in real organizations. And when the ecosystem gap bites, the component libraries, the hiring pool, the mountain of Stack Overflow answers, the AI models trained on millions of React examples, those all favor the incumbent. HTMX's ecosystem is real and growing and much smaller. If you need an accessible, battle-tested, complicated component this week, you'll find it for React, and you may build it yourself for HTMX. If none of those apply to what you're building, and for a huge share of CRUD applications, content sites, dashboards, admin panels, and internal tools, none of them do, then HTMX isn't a quirky choice. It's arguably the correct one, and the burden of proof is on the heavier option. And now the argument I promised, the AI one. Here's a thesis I think is underrated, and I'd genuinely like to be argued with in the comments. Hypermedia architectures may be the most AI agent-friendly way to build web applications right now. 3 reasons. 1. One language instead of 3. When you ask a coding agent to add a feature to a modern client-side app, it has to touch your server code, your API schema, your client-side data fetching, your state management, and your component, and keep all of them consistent with each other. Every one of those seams is a place for it to hallucinate an endpoint that doesn't exist, or a prop that was renamed. In a Hypermedia app, the change is usually one handler on the server, one template, fewer seams, fewer opportunities to be confidently wrong. 2. The output is verifiable. An agent writing HTML produces something you can look at. An agent writing client-side state management produces something that looks fine and fails in a specific interaction sequence 3 weeks later. Given that we're all now reviewing far more machine-written code than we used to, and we've covered on this channel exactly how agents cut corners on large change sets, architectures whose correctness is visible have a real and growing advantage. 3. Less context required. An agent working on a Hypermedia app needs to hold less of your system in its head to make a correct change. Less context needed means fewer mistakes, cheaper runs, and better results from smaller models, including the local ones we spend most of our time on here. And then there's the streaming point from earlier, which is the practical version of all this. HTMX 4's fetch-based core streams natively, and language model output is a stream. Building an AI feature into a Hypermedia app just got substantially simpler. Now the counter-argument, honestly, coding agents have seen vastly more React than HTMX in training. Ask any model for a React component and you'll get a fluent, idiomatic answer. Ask for something non-trivial in HTMX and you may get something that's subtly 10-year-old advice. That's a real present-day disadvantage, and it's the strongest argument against my own thesis. My honest read, the architectural advantage is structural and permanent. The training data disadvantage is temporary and shrinking. But it's a genuine tension, and I'd rather name it than hide it. So, should you use it? Practical guidance. 3 cases. If you're on HTMX2 today, don't rush. That's not my advice. It's effectively the maintainer's. Support is perpetual, 2.x stays the default recommendation for a good while, and 4.0 becomes the standard around 2027. Read the migration notes, try 4.0 on something small, and plan the real migration for when it suits you. Nobody is taking your version away. If you're starting something new, this is a genuinely interesting moment and you have a real decision to make. Starting on 4.0 means you never do the migration at all. You begin with the modern event model, explicit inheritance, and streaming built in. The trade-off is that, as of this recording, you'd be building on a beta. Documentation still catching up, extensions still porting, and the possibility of small changes before the stable tag. My honest read, if you're shipping to production next month, start on 2.x, which is stable, enormous, and supported forever. If you're starting something that won't ship until late in the year, or you're building to learn, go straight to 4 and skip the migration entirely. Neither answer is wrong. They're just different appetites for the same trade-off. If you've never touched HTMX, the cheapest possible experiment is one script tag on a page you already have and one attribute on one button. 15 minutes. If your reaction is, wait, that's it? That's the reaction, and you'll know within an afternoon whether the philosophy fits how you think. If your reaction is, I miss my components, that's a completely legitimate answer too, and you've learned it for the price of an afternoon. Step back, because there's a pattern here that this channel has been documenting all month in a completely different domain. Watch what these stories have in common. A model that runs on your own hardware instead of someone's cloud. A knowledge format that's just a folder of text files instead of a database. Agent procedures written in plain markdown instead of a platform. And now a web library that's 14 kilobytes of attributes instead of a build pipeline, whose creator's core commitment is that he will not make you rewrite your application for his convenience. Every one of those is the same idea wearing different clothes. The winning move keeps turning out to be radical simplicity plus genuine ownership. Not the heaviest tool, the one you can read, run, and keep. And notice the specific thing HTMX offers that almost nothing else in this industry does. Not speed, not features, permanence. The promise that the thing you build today will still work, unchanged, years from now, without anyone forcing your hand. In a field that has trained every developer to expect a rewrite every 18 months, that's not a technical feature. It's a moral position, and HTMX 4 of all releases is the one that proves the position is real, because look at how carefully they broke their own rule. So here's my question, and I'll pin it below. Is finished software a real goal or a fantasy? Can a library genuinely reach a state where it's done, or does every project eventually have to break its promises to stay relevant? Because HTMX just tested that idea in public, and I'm honestly not sure which way the answer falls. Tell me what you think, and tell me whether you've shipped anything real with HTMX, because I want the comment section on this one to be builders, not just spectators. Every link, Carson Gross's original essay, the migration notes, the current release status, and the Drupal initiative tracking all of this in public is in the description, so you can verify every claim I've made. That's the standard on this channel. The real explanation, sourced in plain English, with the limits included. And this is the start of a new series here on Stacks you can actually own. The simple, permanent, boring in a good way tools that quietly beat the heavy ones. If that's your kind of thing, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.